This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real events. Names, dates, locations, and identifying details have been changed or dramatized to protect privacy and enhance the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental or used fictitiously. This content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not aim to glorify crime, promote violence, or pass judgment on real individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. Some scenes may contain mature, disturbing, or triggering content. What you are about to watch could have happened anywhere, to anyone. It's inspired by real events. Whispers of truth, buried beneath layers of fiction. We've changed the names, the dates, the locations, but the emotions, the betrayal, the fear, those are real. This story is not meant to accuse, only to reveal, to make you question, who do you really trust? If stories like this keep you thinking, long after they end, hit subscribe, smash like, and drop your theory in the comments. Now watch closely, before the truth disappears again.
He stood before his congregation beneath a river of stained glass light, voice rising like thunder, eyes shimmering with conviction. Every word felt divine. Every gesture commanded devotion. To the people of Dallas County, Reverend Samuel Hayes wasn't just a preacher. He was proof that God still walked among men. The choir roared behind him, and 1,000 voices answered. Mothers cried. Men trembled. He raised his hand, blessing them with a smile that could calm any storm. But deep in his jacket pocket lay a secret that could drown him. A folded napkin. A tiny bag of white powder. The same hand that lifted Bibles to heaven now trembled against the weight of its own sin. He told himself it was just once, just enough to take the edge off. But sin never stops at once. Among the sea of believers sat one who knew him best, his daughter, Grace. She watched her father preach about purity and salvation, never suspecting the storm already inside him. His words cracked. His eyes darted. Something about him felt wrong. When the service ended, Grace ran to hug him. The moment their faces touched, she caught a strange scent, faint, chemical, metallic. She thought he was just tired. But that smell would return. Again, and again. Outside, cameras flashed as the Reverend greeted worshippers and smiled for local news crews. To everyone watching, he was untouchable, the voice of light in a dark world. No one saw the panic behind that smile. No one saw the man slipping deeper into the thing he condemned. That Sunday morning would be remembered for his sermon about redemption. But history would remember it for something else, as the day the first crack appeared in the mask. And through that crack, the truth began to seep in. Before the scandal. Before the whispers. Reverend Samuel Hayes was the kind of man who could make you believe the light itself spoke through him. Few noticed that the same light was already burning him from the inside. He started small. 15 folding chairs in a rented community hall, a borrowed microphone, and a voice that carried like fire through cold hearts. He preached of forgiveness, of second chances, of how God could raise the broken into greatness. Within 10 years, that voice built an empire. The River of Light Ministries became a kingdom of glass and marble, cameras hanging from rafters, gold-trimmed pulpits, and a choir whose sound could make sinners weep. Every Sunday, cars stretched for miles. Families brought their sick and their hopeless, believing one touch from the Reverend could heal what medicine couldn't. He was everywhere, television, newspapers, local billboards. The media called him the Shepherd of the South. Politicians sought his blessing. Businesses sought his endorsement. To the world, he was faith made flesh. He prayed for addicts to find freedom, never realizing that one day he would be among them. But every empire built on secrets trembles long before it falls. It began with small things, a sermon cut short, a trembling hand, a missed meeting explained away by exhaustion. His laughter faded. His eyes dimmed. When cameras flashed, he turned away, claiming humility, but really, he feared what they might catch. He told himself the powder helped him focus. That it gave him energy to preach longer, love deeper, save more souls. In his mind, even sin could serve the Spirit. Then came the money. Donations vanished into untraceable accounts. Late-night withdrawals, luxury hotels billed as spiritual retreats. No one dared to question him. Faith can make people blind, and the brighter the light, the easier it is to hide in its glare. Behind the pulpit, the preacher's voice still roared. He thundered against temptation, against lust, against the devil's snares, even as he sank into all three. And every word, every tear, every prayer became part of the disguise. Among those listening was Grace, his only daughter. To her, he was still the man who prayed over her nightmares, who said truth was a shield no lie could pierce. She believed him completely, until the day she saw the first lie for herself. The church saw a savior. The city saw a saint. But Grace was about to see the addict. Grace Hayes had always believed her father was the closest thing to perfect, until she started noticing how often perfection came home past midnight. He was her protector, her teacher, her hero. The man who prayed over every meal and told her that truth was a light that never went out. But lately, that light had started to flicker. It began quietly. A credit card receipt for a trip he never took. Phone calls ending the instant she entered the room. Nights when his study light burned long after everyone was asleep. She told herself he was just busy, that pastors carried burdens the world couldn't see. But the more she tried to explain it away, the louder her curiosity became. One night, unable to sleep, she crept toward the sliver of light beneath his study door. Through the crack, she saw her father, shoulders hunched, whispering to himself, hands trembling. The Bible lay open in front of him, but beside it sat a mirror dusted with residue. A line of white glimmered under the lamp like frost. Grace froze. The man who taught her to walk in truth was kneeling before a different kind of altar. The next morning, she convinced herself it couldn't be real. Maybe it was medicine. Maybe exhaustion. Anything but what it looked like. But denial is just another form of faith, and faith doesn't last when evidence knocks twice. A week later, while tidying his office, she opened the top drawer. Inside was a small velvet pouch, a silver straw, and that same metallic scent she'd once caught after church. Her hands trembled. Her throat closed. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply turned on her phone camera. And from that moment on, the truth would never stop recording, even when she wished it would. Grace began documenting everything. His late-night drives. His erratic moods. The trembling hands at Sunday service. She saved screenshots of messages, photographed ledgers, filmed whispered conversations through the door. Each file was another crack in the image of the man she adored. Yet she wasn't trying to destroy him, she was trying to save him. That was the tragedy, she believed the truth could heal. One stormy night, she followed him. He drove beyond the city lights, deep into a part of town he once called the Valley of Sin. She parked a few spaces behind and waited. Rain hammered the windshield, drowning her prayers. When he returned 30 minutes later, his eyes were glassy. He leaned against the car, muttering a prayer that sounded more like surrender. Grace had all the proof she needed. But proof means nothing when love still lives. Days passed in silence. She smiled at family dinners, nodded through sermons, and pretended not to see the trembling beneath his calm. Every time he said, "Truth will set you free," her chest tightened with anger she couldn't release. Then came the final piece, the one that turned fear into certainty. While helping organize church donations, she logged into his laptop to print receipts. That's when she saw it, a short, cold email. "We need our payment. You're out of time." Her blood went cold. The man who preached salvation was now bargaining with devils. That evening, she stood outside his study door, trembling, heart pounding against her ribs. And softly, almost as if praying, she said, I know what you've done. He looked up from his desk, eyes wide, wild, and afraid. No one heard what came next. But everyone would live with its echo. Addiction doesn't fall like thunder. It creeps in like fog, quiet, familiar, and impossible to see until it's all around you. At first, Reverend Hayes still showed up, sharp suit, perfect smile, scripture on his tongue. But the light behind his eyes had dimmed. The man who once walked through crowds with steady grace now flinched at sudden noises, avoided mirrors, and kept his hands clasped too tight, as if prayer alone could hold him together. The church began to whisper. They said he looked tired. That his voice had changed. He stumbled over verses, lost pages mid-sermon, and called it God's mysterious way. But everyone could feel it. Something sacred was slipping. At home, silence replaced prayer. Grace stopped sitting in the front pew. Deborah stopped defending him when he came home late, carrying the smell of chemicals and regret. Their family dinners, once alive with laughter and grace, became wordless rituals, 3 people sitting at the same table, each pretending not to notice the distance growing between them. For a while, the house became a museum of silence, everyone moving carefully, as if sound itself could break something sacred. Then the shouting began. There were nights when anger filled the walls, when his voice echoed through the halls like a storm breaking loose. Grace would retreat to her room, holding her phone, proof in one hand, heartbreak in the other. She wanted to believe he could still be saved. But salvation doesn't come to those who hide from the truth. He started making mistakes, small ones that grew into scandals. A missing offering envelope here. A suspicious withdrawal there. The deacons noticed. The accountant raised questions. Each lie he told to cover the last only deepened the hole beneath his feet. And when the drugs wore off, guilt gave way to rage. He accused his wife of betrayal. Told his daughter she would never understand what it feels like to carry other people's souls on your back. But the truth was simpler, he couldn't even carry his own anymore. One evening, Deborah found him in the church parking lot, sitting in his car, hands trembling, tears cutting down his face. He looked up but said nothing. And she said nothing back. Some silences carry more truth than sermons. Then, as quick as the tenderness came, it vanished. He lashed out, told her to stop following him, to stop watching. Then drove off into the dark, headlights trembling through the mist. By late spring, he was unraveling, publicly now. One Sunday, halfway through a sermon about temptation, his voice cracked, and his knees buckled. The choir rushed to his side as the congregation gasped. He said he was fasting, that God was testing his body. But Grace knew the truth. The body had already failed the spirit. That night, she made her choice. If he wouldn't confess, she would. Somewhere deep beneath the lies and the chemicals, a small part of him still reached for grace, but by then, even Grace was afraid to reach back. The air was heavy that evening, thick with summer heat and silence, the same silence that had been growing inside their home for months. Even the walls seemed to sense that something sacred had finally cracked. Grace spent the day alone, replaying her father's sermons on her phone, listening to the man he used to be. By nightfall, she decided she couldn't protect him anymore. The truth was too heavy to keep hidden. Around 9, she walked down the hall toward his study, phone in her pocket, heart pounding like a drum in an empty church. Behind the door, she heard the faint scrape of a chair, the soft whisper of pages turning. She opened it gently. Reverend Hayes sat at his desk beneath a single lamp, head bowed, the light throwing his shadow across the wall. For a moment, he didn't notice her. He was whispering a prayer, or maybe rehearsing one. She stood there, watching him, not with anger, but with grief. Love had brought her to that door, not vengeance. Love for a man who had already lost himself. When he finally looked up, their eyes met, father and daughter, mirror and reflection. The air between them turned colder than the room itself. Grace spoke first. Her voice was calm, though her hands trembled. She told him she knew. That she had seen the messages, the money, the drugs. She said she couldn't stay silent anymore. For a long time, he said nothing. Then came the denial, quick, polished, desperate. He called her mistaken. Confused. But when she reached for her phone and pressed play, the lie shattered. The man who once commanded thousands couldn't command a single word. He stood, trembling, voice cracking between fear and fury. He begged her not to ruin him. Not to destroy the church. Not to destroy their family. But Grace didn't flinch. She told him the truth was already destroying everything, just slower. Then came the shouting. The argument spread through the house like fire, voices rising, footsteps echoing, the sound of something fragile breaking. Then came the silence, the kind that doesn't end, the kind that rewrites every memory you ever loved. Hours passed before flashing lights painted the walls. By then, the house was quiet again, too quiet. When police arrived, they found Reverend Hayes sitting on the kitchen floor. His shirt was stained. His eyes were empty. He kept repeating one sentence, over and over. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted her to listen." Grace's body was found near a shallow creek, not far from the house. The investigators said she had been moved. The struggle had happened at home. The recordings she made were still intact. By dawn, the story was everywhere. The same man they once called the Shepherd of the South had become a headline of heartbreak. Reporters gathered outside the church. Some congregants wept. Others shouted that it was the devil's work. But no prayer could undo what that night had written. When morning came, Reverend Hayes was led away in handcuffs, head bowed, face hidden beneath the red and blue glow of police lights. Behind him, the church bell rang for Sunday service. It sounded hollow now, as if even heaven had turned its face away. Some say they still hear Grace's voice in the choir room on quiet evenings, soft, steady, filled with the truth her father couldn't face. The investigation began before dawn, in the same house where Grace's voice once filled the air. Now, only silence remained, sealed behind yellow tape. Detectives moved through the darkness with quiet precision. Flashlights swept across the lawn, cameras clicked, and neighbors whispered from behind fences, fragments of prayers for a family that had already fallen apart. Inside, the air was heavy, grief, chemical residue, and the faint scent of old furniture polish. Everything looked ordinary, except for what had been left behind, a broken lamp, a blood stain near the kitchen doorway, and a Bible lying open on the floor. The verse read, "My tears have been my food day and night." Detective Marcus Lang led the case. He'd seen 100 murders, but this one was different, as if faith itself had been a witness. Later, he said what struck him most wasn't the blood or the silence. It was the stillness, the feeling that the house had already confessed. They found Grace's phone first, shattered near the hallway. The data synced automatically to cloud storage, and within hours, detectives uncovered recordings that told the story she hadn't lived to finish. Dozens of files, each a piece of her father's unraveling. The evidence came together like a puzzle no one wanted to solve. Her fingerprints in his study. His DNA under her nails. And a text from his phone, sent hours before her death, "We'll settle it tonight." When Reverend Hayes was questioned, his tone was flat, neither defensive nor pleading. He said he didn't remember much. Just shouting, confusion, a fall. When they told him Grace was gone, he didn't cry. He only whispered, "Then I failed twice, once as a father, once as a man of God." By mid-morning, the story had escaped the walls of the home. News vans lined the street. Reporters spoke softly of a pastor with a double life. Members of his congregation arrived in disbelief, clutching Bibles like shields. Some prayed for him, others for his daughter. No one knew which side heaven was on anymore. Inside the precinct, detectives assembled the case, phone logs, bank records, surveillance footage. Everything Grace had collected in secret was now guiding the truth forward. It was as if she was still fighting, her voice steady, her courage echoing through the evidence. Deborah Hayes sat through hours of questioning, pale, silent, her wedding ring clutched between trembling fingers. She told investigators she had feared for him, but never from him. That his eyes had changed months ago. When asked if she pitied him, she nodded once and said, "He was drowning. We just didn't see how deep." Forensic experts rebuilt the timeline to the minute. The prosecution had motive, proof, and a voice that wouldn't die. When they played Grace's recordings in court, the room fell silent, as if the truth itself demanded reverence. Even the judge bowed his head for a moment. The church issued a statement the next day, calling it a tragedy beyond understanding, a wound only truth could heal. But the truth had already taken everything. When asked again why it happened, Reverend Hayes said quietly, "I thought I could fix everything before it broke." But by the time he tried, everything already had. The investigation revealed more than a crime. It revealed the quiet war between truth and denial, a war Grace fought alone, and won too late. 10 days after Grace's voice last echoed in that courtroom, the world finally heard its verdict. Reverend Samuel Hayes, guilty of second-degree murder. Life in prison. He didn't flinch when the sentence was read. He didn't plead for mercy. He just lowered his head, as though praying to a God he no longer recognized. The trial had lasted only 10 days. 10 days of recordings, tears, and truth that refused to stay buried. Every file Grace left behind was played before the jury. Her voice, calm, steady, unshaken, told the story she never got to finish. When the final recording ended, the room was silent. Even the judge looked down, as if ashamed of how far faith had fallen. When the courtroom doors closed, another set opened to emptiness, the church he once called home. The River of Light Ministries shut its doors soon after. The stained glass that once glowed like heaven's fire shattered in a summer storm. Shards littered the pews. Dust covered the pulpit. And the cross above it hung crooked, like a question no one could answer. Outside, the city mourned and argued. Some called him a fallen shepherd. Others said he was a man destroyed by his own secrets. But everyone agreed, nothing holy would ever sound the same again. Deborah Hayes moved away quietly. She sold the house, left the town, and stopped taking calls from reporters. Every Sunday, she visited her daughter's grave, sitting in silence for hours, tracing Grace's name with her fingers. Some evenings she brought flowers. Other times she brought nothing but silence, because some losses bloom on their own. In prison, Samuel Hayes became a ghost of himself. He stopped preaching. Stopped writing. For months, he refused to leave his cell for chapel. The same man who once told others that truth brings freedom, now sat in the dark, unable to face his own. 5 years later, a guard cleaning the cell found a notebook beneath his bed. Each page began the same way. "My daughter, my light, my lost redemption." He wrote that addiction had not been the devil's temptation, but the echo of his own emptiness. That every sermon he preached had been a cry for help no one heard, not even him. The final page read, "I told them that God saves. But I never told them what happens to those he doesn't." The world moved on, as it always does. The story faded from headlines, filed away under tragedy. But for those who remembered, the name Hayes became both a warning and a prayer. 5 years later, the church reopened under new leadership. The pews filled again. The choir sang again. But on quiet evenings, when the lights dimmed and the air grew still, some swore they could hear a faint voice in the rafters, soft, warm, and unafraid. As if Grace herself still lingered there, making sure the truth never went silent again. And deep inside a Texas prison, a man once praised as holy still woke every morning to the sound of chapel bells, each one tolling the memory of the life he destroyed. He once said the truth would set you free. And in the end, maybe it did, just not the way he imagined. Because truth set Grace free. It cost her life, but it freed her from fear, from silence, from carrying someone else's sin.